The train whistle screamed through Manassa, Colorado, and Kendra James kept waving long after every other person on the platform had turned away, long after her arm should have grown tired, long after it made any kind of sense. Quinn Yates saw her through the dusty window of the westbound passenger car, that small figure in a blue calico dress growing smaller with each turn of the iron wheels. Her hand moved back and forth in the autumn sunlight, like she was trying to hold him there through sheer force of will. He had met her 5 days ago, 5 days that had rearranged everything he thought he knew about where he was going and why. The locomotive picked up speed as it left Manassa behind, heading toward the next depot 12 miles west. Quinn stood up. The man across from him looked up from his newspaper with mild curiosity. "This your stop?" the man asked. "No," Quinn said, "but it will be." He grabbed his saddlebag from the overhead rack and his hat from the seat beside him, his heart hammered against his ribs. He had never done anything this foolish in his 26 years, and he had done plenty of foolish things. The cattle drive to Wyoming that had ended with him broke and walking home. The poker game in Denver, where he had bet his best horse on a pair of jacks. The time he had followed a rumor of gold into the San Juan Mountains in February and nearly frozen to death. This felt different. This felt like the kind of foolish that might actually be wise. The train slowed as it approached Antonito, the next town on the line. Quinn was already standing by the door when the conductor came through. "Antonito," the conductor called out. "5-minute stop." Quinn swung down onto the platform before the train had fully stopped. The conductor gave him a strange look but said nothing. There were rules about where passengers could board and where they could leave, but this was 1886 in southern Colorado, and rules were more like suggestions out here. The platform was nearly empty. An older woman with 2 children waited with their luggage. A clerk from the depot stood smoking a cigarette. Quinn walked past them all and started down the dirt road that led back toward Manassa. 12 miles. He could walk it in 4 hours if he kept a good pace. Maybe 3.5. The sun was past its peak but still high enough. He would make it back before dark. His boots were made for riding, not walking. By the first mile, he could feel the beginnings of blisters forming on both heels. By the second mile, those blisters had definitely arrived. He kept walking. The road followed the railroad tracks for stretches, then curved away through open grassland dotted with sage and pinon pine. Mountains rose to the north and east, their peaks already touched with early snow. The air smelled like dust and distance. Quinn thought about how he had met Kendra. He had been passing through Manassa on his way to California, planning to stay one night at most. He had been looking for work on one of the big ranches out west, something that would pay better than the small ranch jobs he had been picking up around Colorado for the past 3 years. At the mercantile, buying supplies for the journey, he had reached for a can of peaches at the exact same moment she did. Their hands had touched. She had pulled back, apologizing. He had insisted she take the peaches. She had laughed and said they could split them if he was staying for supper. That laugh had stopped him cold. It was not a polite laugh or a flirtatious laugh. It was genuine, the sound of someone who found real joy in small absurdities. He had stayed for supper. Then he had stayed another day, then another. Kendra lived with her father, Howard James, a widower who ran a small freight business. Her mother had died 2 years before from pneumonia. Kendra had been running the household ever since, managing everything from the books for her father's business to the vegetable garden behind their house. She was 23 years old and had never been more than 50 miles from Manassa. They had spent those 5 days talking. Really talking, the way Quinn had never quite managed with anyone before. She told him about her mother, about how she still expected to hear her voice calling from the other room sometimes. He told her about growing up on a hardscrabble ranch in Texas, about how his father had died when Quinn was 15, and how his mother had remarried a man who made it clear there was no room for a nearly grown stepson. On the fourth day, they had ridden out to the hot springs north of town. The water had steamed in the cool October air. They had sat on rocks near the edge, not touching, but close enough that Quinn could see the exact color of her eyes, which were brown with small flecks of gold. "You are really going to California," she had said. It was not a question. "That was the plan," he had answered. Plans change sometimes. Sometimes they do, but they had not talked about what that might mean. And on the fifth day, when Quinn's money had run low enough that he could not justify another night at the boarding house, he had bought his ticket west. Kendra had walked with him to the depot. She had been quiet on the walk over, and he had been quiet too, both of them carrying the weight of things unsaid. At the platform, she had finally spoken. "I hope you find what you are looking for out there. What if what I am looking for is here?" She had looked at him then, really looked at him, and he had seen something in her face that made his chest tight. "You have known me 5 days, Quinn Yates. 5 days is not enough to change your whole life. Feels like it might be. Feelings change. Do they?" The train had arrived then, great huffing beast of iron and steam. He had climbed aboard. She had stayed on the platform, and as the train pulled away, she had started waving. He had waved back, watching her through the window, and she had kept waving even when he knew she could barely see him anymore. That was when he had stood up. By the 3rd mile back to Manassa, Quinn was thirsty. He had a canteen on his saddle, but his saddle was in the livery stable back in Manassa, along with his horse. He had not planned to walk 12 miles today. He had not planned any of this. A wagon passed him going the opposite direction, the driver giving him a curious nod. Quinn nodded back and kept walking. His feet hurt worse now, a steady burning in both heels. He tried to think about something else. He thought about Kendra's hands, which were strong and work-worn but moved with surprising grace when she was writing in the ledger for her father's business. He thought about the way she had looked at the hot springs, her face relaxed in a way he suspected it rarely was. He thought about the fact that she had let him leave. That was the part that worried him as he walked. She had not asked him to stay. She had not cried or made a scene. She had simply waved goodbye, and maybe that wave had been just what it looked like, a genuine farewell. Maybe he was walking back toward nothing. But she had kept waving, long after it made sense. That had to mean something. The sun moved lower in the sky. Quinn's shadow stretched out long in front of him. He passed a farmhouse where a dog barked at him from behind a fence. He passed a broken wagon wheel lying in the grass beside the road. He passed a mile marker that said Manassa was still 6 miles ahead. His legs ached now, not just his feet. He was in good shape from years of ranch work, but walking was different from riding, used different muscles. He kept going. As he walked, he tried to figure out what he would say when he got there. Something romantic, probably. Something about how he could not leave. But that felt too simple. Kendra was not the kind of woman who would be impressed by simple declarations. She would want to know the practical things. Where would he live? What would he do for work? How did he plan to support himself in a town he barely knew? Good questions. He did not have answers to any of them yet. The road curved through a stand of cottonwood trees, their leaves gold and rustling in the late afternoon breeze. Quinn stopped for a moment in the shade, leaning against a trunk and trying to ignore his screaming feet. He thought about taking off his boots to check the damage, but he was afraid if he did, he would not be able to get them back on. He pushed away from the tree and kept walking. By the time Manassa came into view, the sun was touching the tops of the western mountains. Quinn's throat was so dry it hurt to swallow. His feet were definitely bleeding inside his boots. He could feel the wet warmth of it, but he was close now. Close enough to see the church steeple and the false front buildings of the main street. He limped down the road into town. A few people noticed him, their expressions curious. He must have looked strange, a man in dusty traveling clothes walking into town from the west without a horse or a wagon. He ignored them and headed straight for the James house, which was on the edge of town past the livery stable. It was a modest house, wood frame with a covered porch and a well-maintained garden beside it. Smoke rose from the chimney. Quinn stopped at the front gate, suddenly terrified. What if her father answered the door? What if Kendra took one look at him and told him he was crazy? What if this grand gesture was just that, a gesture, and not the beginning of anything real? He opened the gate, walked up the path, climbed the 3 steps to the porch, knocked, footsteps inside. The door opened. Kendra stood there, still in her blue calico dress. Her eyes went wide. Quinn. "I got off at Antonito," he said. His voice came out rough and dry. "Walked back." She stared at him. "You walked? That is 12 miles. 12 and a half, I think. Why would you do that?" "Because you kept waving. And I could not stop thinking about why you would keep waving if you actually wanted me to go." Her hand was still on the door. He could not read her expression. Fear ran through him, sharp and cold. "That was a foolish thing to do," she said finally. "Probably. Your feet must be destroyed." "Definitely. You do not even have a place to stay here. You already left the boarding house." "I know." She looked at him for a long moment. Then she stepped back and opened the door wider. "Come inside before you fall over." The relief that washed through him was so strong it made him dizzy. He stepped into the house. It was warm inside and smelled like cooking onions and wood smoke. Kendra closed the door behind him. "Sit down," she said, pointing to a chair by the kitchen table. "Let me see your feet." He sat. She knelt in front of him and started unlacing his boots. He winced as she pulled the first one off. His sock was indeed bloody. She made a small sound in her throat. "You are an idiot," she said, but her voice was gentle. "I know." She pulled off the other boot, then both socks, revealing blisters that had burst and bled. She stood and went to a cupboard, pulling out clean cloth and a jar of something that looked like salve. "My father is out on a freight run," she said as she worked, cleaning the wounds with careful efficiency. "He will not be back until tomorrow. Kendra, let me finish." She bandaged both feet, her hands steady and sure. When she was done, she sat back on her heels and finally looked up at him. "Why did you really come back?" she asked. "Because 5 days might not be enough to change a whole life," he said. "But it was enough to know I wanted to try." "Try what?" "Being someone who stays. Building something that matters. Doing it here with you if you will let me." Her eyes were shining now, bright with tears that had not quite fallen. "You do not know me well enough to be saying things like that. Then let me get to know you better. Let me stay and see what this could be. I am not asking you to marry me tomorrow, Kendra. I am just asking for a chance." She was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, "I let you go because I was afraid." "Of what?" "Of the same thing that happened with my mother. Of caring about someone and then losing them. After she died, I told myself it was easier not to want things. Easier to just take care of my father and the business and not think about what I might want for myself. And then you showed up, and you were kind and funny, and you listened when I talked. And I wanted things again. But wanting things is terrifying when you know how fast they can be taken away." Quinn reached out and took her hand. "I cannot promise I will never leave or never die or that nothing bad will ever happen. Nobody can promise that, but I can promise that I came back. And I will keep coming back as long as you want me to." A tear slid down her cheek. She did not wipe it away. "You need somewhere to stay." "I do." The boarding house is full this week. There is a wagon train passing through and they took all the rooms. I will figure something out." She stood up, still holding his hand. "There is a room here. It was my mother's sewing room. It has a bed in it. You could stay here if you help my father with the freight business. He has been trying to manage it alone since I cannot lift the heavy loads and it is too much for one person. If you worked for him, he could pay you enough for room and board." Quinn stood too, careful on his bandaged feet. "You are offering me a job and a room. I am offering you a chance. The same thing you asked me for." He wanted to kiss her, but it felt too soon, too presumptuous. Instead, he squeezed her hand. "I will take it." She smiled then, a real smile that lit up her whole face. "You are still an idiot for walking 12 miles on those feet. Best decision I ever made." Her father, Howard James, returned the next evening. He was a solid man in his 50s with gray in his beard and eyes that assessed Quinn carefully when Kendra introduced them. She explained the situation over dinner, how Quinn had come back and needed work, how the business needed another strong back. Howard listened, chewing his food thoughtfully. Finally, he said, "You any good with horses?" "Yes, sir," Quinn said. "Grew up on a ranch, can handle a team as well as I can ride. Can you read and figure numbers?" "Well enough." "And you understand that if you are living under my roof and working for me, you will treat my daughter with respect?" "Yes, sir." Howard nodded slowly. "All right then. We will try it for a month, see how it works out. But understand this, young man. I do not care how far you walked or how romantic the story is. If you hurt her, I will make you regret it." "Understood, sir." They shook hands. Quinn saw Kendra hide a smile behind her water glass. The first month was harder than Quinn had expected. Not the work itself, though that was demanding enough. Howard ran a freight business that hauled everything from mining equipment to dry goods between Manassa and the surrounding towns. The loads were heavy, the hours were long, and the roads were rough. But Quinn was used to hard work. The hard part was living in the same house as Kendra and not being able to touch her, not being able to pull her aside and kiss her the way he wanted to. They were always under Howard's watchful eye, always aware of propriety and what the town might say if things looked improper. They talked, though. Every evening after dinner, after Howard had gone to his room, Quinn and Kendra would sit at the kitchen table and talk. She told him about growing up in Manassa, about the years before her mother got sick. He told her more about Texas, about the ranch he had left behind. Slowly, they learned each other. Quinn discovered that Kendra hated mornings but loved staying up late, that she had a sharp head for business and could calculate freight costs faster than he could write them down. She learned that he had a habit of humming while he worked, that he was meticulous about caring for the horses, that he had a temper but rarely showed it. On Sunday afternoons, when Howard took his weekly rest, Quinn and Kendra would walk together. Sometimes into town, sometimes out to the fields beyond. Always proper, always in view of anyone who might be watching, but those walks became the center of Quinn's week. On one such walk, about 6 weeks after he had returned, Kendra asked him, "Do you regret it, giving up California?" They were walking along the creek that ran east of town, the water low and slow in the late November cold. "No," he said honestly. "I thought I wanted to work on some big ranch, make good money, see new places, but that was just because I had not found a reason to stop moving yet." "And now you have," he looked at her. She was wearing a brown wool coat and a knitted hat that framed her face. Her cheeks were pink from the cold. "Yes." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "My father likes you." "He does. He told me last night that you are a good worker, that you are reliable, that he trusts you with the business." She paused. "He does not say things like that lightly." "I am glad. He also said that if you wanted to court me properly, he would allow it." Quinn stopped walking. Kendra stopped too, turning to face him. "He said that?" Quinn asked. "He did." "And what do you say?" She smiled, that smile that had made him get off the train in the first place. "I say yes, Quinn Yates. I say yes." He kissed her then, right there by the creek with the cold wind blowing and the mountains watching. It was their first kiss, and it tasted like possibility. Courting Kendra was different than Quinn had imagined courting would be. For one thing, they already lived in the same house, which meant there was none of the usual ritual of calling on her or waiting in a parlor. For another, they worked together every day, managing the freight business alongside Howard, so they saw each other in all kinds of conditions, not just at their best. Quinn learned that Kendra was stubborn as a mule when she thought she was right, which was most of the time. She learned that Quinn could be impulsive and sometimes made decisions without thinking them through, like walking 12 miles on bleeding feet. They had their first real fight in January, 3 months after Quinn had returned. It was over something small, a scheduling conflict for a freight delivery. Quinn thought they should take the faster route through the mountain pass. Kendra thought they should take the longer route through the valley because snow might close the pass. They argued about it at the dinner table until Howard finally slammed his hand down and said, "Enough. Take the valley route. Kendra knows this country better than you do, Quinn." Quinn had been angry at first, but later, after he had cooled down, he realized Howard was right. And more importantly, he realized that Kendra was not going to defer to him just because he was a man or because she loved him. She had her own mind and her own expertise, and if he wanted to be with her, he needed to respect that. He apologized that night. She accepted. They moved on. In February, a hard storm hit the valley. Snow piled up 3 feet deep, and the temperature dropped so low that water froze in its buckets overnight. The freight business ground to a halt. Nobody could travel, not safely. They were stuck in the house for nearly 2 weeks. Quinn thought it might be unbearable being cooped up like that. But instead, it was wonderful. He and Kendra played cards by the fire. She taught him to make biscuits. He taught her a song his mother used to sing. Howard told stories about the early days of Manassa, when it had been nothing but a handful of tents and big dreams. One night during the storm, when Howard had gone to bed early, Quinn and Kendra sat by the fire together. She was leaning against him, her head on his shoulder, and he had his arm around her. "I have been thinking," she said quietly. "About what? About the future. About what happens next. What do you want to happen next?" She was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, "I want to expand the business. My father is talking about retiring in a few years, and if he does, the business would come to me, to us if we are married by then." Quinn's heart skipped. "Is that what you want, to get married? Eventually. Not tomorrow, but someday." "If you want that too, I do." She turned to look up at him. "But I do not want to just run the business the way it is. I want to make it bigger. Better. There is opportunity here, Quinn. The railroad is bringing more people, and more people means more freight. We could expand into passenger transport too, running a coach service between the towns. We could build something real." He saw the excitement in her eyes, the vision she had of what they could create together. It was not the life he had imagined back when he was heading to California, but it was better. It was a life built on partnership and shared dreams. "Then let's do it," he said. They were married in April, a small ceremony at the church with half the town in attendance. Kendra wore her mother's wedding dress, altered to fit her. Quinn wore a new suit that Howard had helped him buy. Howard walked Kendra down the aisle, and when he placed her hand in Quinn's, he said quietly, "Take care of her." "I will," Quinn promised. They spent their wedding night in the house, in what had been the sewing room and was now their room. It was strange and wonderful and a little awkward, the way first times often are, but they laughed through the awkwardness and held each other close afterward. "I am glad you came back," Kendra whispered in the dark. "Me too." Over the next year, they poured themselves into the business. Howard gradually handed over more responsibility as his joints grew stiffer, and he found he preferred staying close to home. Quinn and Kendra ran the freight routes, negotiated contracts, hired 2 additional men to help with the heavy loads. Kendra had been right about the opportunity. As more settlers arrived in the valley, the demand for their services grew. They added a passenger coach service in the spring, running a regular route between Manassa and Alamosa. By the fall, they were profitable enough to buy a second wagon and hire another driver. They were building something together. In November, a year and a half after Quinn had walked back from Antonito, they bought a piece of land on the edge of town. It was 5 acres with a small creek running through it and a view of the mountains to the north. They planned to build their own house there, something bigger than the room they shared in Howard's house. "What should we call it?" Kendra asked as they stood on the land, imagining where the house would sit. "Call what? The business?" "It has always just been James Freight, but if we are expanding, maybe it should have a new name, something that reflects what it is now." Quinn thought about it. "What about James and Yates Transport?" She smiled. "I like that." They broke ground on the house in the spring. It was going to take time to build, working on it in between running the business, but neither of them minded. They were in no rush. One evening in July, as they were working on framing one of the walls, Kendra said, "I have been thinking about something." "What is that?" "About children." Quinn set down his hammer. This was a conversation they had not really had yet, not directly. "And," he asked carefully, "and I do not think I want them." His first instinct was relief, which surprised him. He had always assumed he would have children someday because that was what people did. But when he really thought about it, when he pictured the life he wanted, it was this. The business, the house, Kendra, building something that would outlast them, that felt like enough. "I do not think I do either," he said slowly. "Is that all right with me?" She laughed. "Quinn, I am the one saying it. I just wanted to make sure you were not expecting something I could not give you." "I am not. I want what we have. I want to grow old with you and build this business into something amazing and sit on the porch of that house when we are 70 and watch the sun go down." She kissed him, there in the half-built house surrounded by sawdust and sunset light. "Then, that is what we will do." Howard passed away peacefully in his sleep in the fall of 1889, 3 years after Quinn had returned. He was 62 years old. They buried him next to Kendra's mother in the Manassa cemetery. Kendra grieved hard. She had known it was coming, had seen her father slowing down over the past year, but knowing did not make it easier. Quinn held her through the worst of it, let her cry when she needed to, gave her space when she needed that instead. "He liked you," she told Quinn one night, a week after the funeral. "He told me once that you coming back was the best thing that ever happened to me. That he had been worried about me staying here just to take care of him, but that you gave me a reason to build a life instead of just maintaining one." He was a good man. He was. They inherited everything, the house and the business and the small savings Howard had accumulated. They sold the house and used the money to finish their own. They moved in that winter, and Kendra hung her mother's quilt over the bed in the main bedroom. James and Yates Transport continued to grow. By 1891, they had 6 wagons and 12 employees. They had contracts with mining companies and ranches and the railroad itself. People knew their name from Antonito to Alamosa to Del Norte. They were successful, but more than that, they were happy. On a cool October evening in 1892, 6 years after Quinn had walked back to Manassa, they sat on their front porch watching the sun set behind the mountains. Kendra had her feet up on the porch rail, and Quinn was leaning back in his chair, comfortable in that easy silence that comes from years of knowing someone. "You ever think about that day at the train station?" Kendra asked. "Sometimes." "Do you ever wonder what would have happened if you had stayed on the train?" Quinn thought about it. "No, not really, because I did not stay on the train. I got off and walked back, and everything that has happened since has happened because of that choice. Best bad decision you ever made." He laughed. "Best good decision, I think." She reached over and took his hand. "I still cannot believe you walked 12 miles on bleeding feet. I still cannot believe you kept waving." "I could not stop. I kept thinking that if I stopped, that would make it real, that you would really be gone. So I just kept waving even though I knew it was pointless." "It was not pointless." "No," she agreed. "It was not." They sat in silence for a while longer, watching the last light fade from the sky. A cool breeze came down from the mountains, carrying the smell of sage and distance. Somewhere in town, a dog barked. The creek behind their house murmured over its rocks. "I love this life," Kendra said quietly. "Everything we have built together. The business, this house, all of it. But mostly I just love that you are here, that you keep being here. I am not going anywhere." "I know. You proved that when you walked back." Quinn thought about that day, his feet bleeding, his throat dry, not knowing what he would find when he arrived. He had been so young then, only 26, and so impulsive. But impulsive had turned out to be right. Coming back had turned out to be the truest thing he had ever done. "You know what I think about sometimes," he said. "What? All the people on that train, where they ended up, if any of them found what they were looking for in California. Do you wish you had found out?" "No. Because what I was looking for was here the whole time. I just did not know it until I saw you waving." She squeezed his hand. "We should go to Antonito sometime." "Why?" "To see it. The place where you got off the train. It feels like it should be important somehow." "All right. We can take the coach next week. Make a day of it." They did. The following Tuesday they drove the coach to Antonito themselves, leaving the business in the hands of their foreman for the day. It was a clear morning, the kind where the sky was so blue it almost hurt to look at. Antonito was bigger than Quinn remembered, or maybe he had just been too focused on walking back to Manassa to notice much 6 years ago. They walked around the town for a while, had lunch at a small restaurant, then went to the train depot. The platform was quiet, no trains due for another hour. They stood together in the spot where Quinn had jumped off, approximately, since he could not quite remember exactly which section of the platform it had been. "This is it," he said. "This is where I made the best decision of my life." Kendra leaned against him. "You could have just gotten back on the train when it came through Manassa again the next day, you know. You did not have to walk." "I know, but I did not want to wait until the next day. I wanted to get back as soon as I could." "What if I had not been home when you got there?" "Then I would have waited. What if I had told you to leave? Then I would have tried to convince you otherwise, and if that had not worked I would have left, but I would have tried." She turned to face him, her back to the tracks. "I am very glad you came back, Quinn Yates." "I am very glad you kept waving, Kendra Yates." They kissed there on the platform, and it felt like closing a circle, like completing something that had started 6 years ago with a train pulling away and a woman waving goodbye. They drove back to Manassa as the afternoon turned to evening. The mountains glowed gold in the late sun, and the road stretched out ahead of them, familiar and welcoming. This was their road now, their valley, their home. James and Yates Transport continued to thrive through the 1890s. They expanded into freight forwarding, acting as agents for goods coming in and out of the valley. They bought the livery stable in Manassa and merged it with their operation. They invested in property in Antonito and Alamosa. But even as the business grew, Quinn and Kendra made sure to keep space for the life they had built together. Sunday afternoons were still for walking, even when they were busy. Friday evenings were for sitting on the porch and watching the sunset. They traveled sometimes, taking the train to Denver or Santa Fe, but they always came back to Manassa. In 1898, they celebrated their 10th wedding anniversary with a party that included half the town. People came from miles around, some of them old friends, some of them business associates who had become friends over the years. There was music and dancing and a massive dinner that took 3 women 2 days to prepare. At one point during the evening, Quinn found himself standing at the edge of the crowd, watching Kendra laugh with a group of women. She was 35 now, and there was some silver beginning to show in her dark hair. She was even more beautiful than she had been at 23, beautiful in the way that comes from years of living a good life with someone you love. Someone came up beside him. It was Robert Whitmore, one of their oldest employees, who had been with them almost from the beginning. "You are a lucky man, boss," Robert said. "I know. She is something special, that wife of yours, smart as a whip and twice as tough. This business would not be half what it is without her. I know that too." "I remember when you first showed up," Robert said, smiling. "Limping into town on those torn-up feet, looking half dead and completely crazy. I thought to myself, that man is either the biggest fool I have ever seen or the smartest. Turns out it was both." Quinn laughed. "Turns out it was." As the party wound down and the guests began to leave, Quinn and Kendra stood together at the door of their house, thanking people for coming. When the last guest had gone and they were finally alone, Kendra kicked off her shoes and sank into a chair with a sigh. "That was wonderful," she said. "But I am exhausted." Quinn sat down across from her. 10 years. 10 years, she agreed. "Feels like longer in a good way, like we have lived a whole lifetime already. We have. Just not the one I thought I was going to live. Better, so much better." She smiled at him, that same smile that had stopped him cold in the mercantile 12 years ago. "Come here." He got up and knelt in front of her chair. She ran her fingers through his hair, which was getting longer than he usually kept it. "Thank you," she said. "For what?" "For getting off the train, for walking back, for staying, for all of it." He took her hands in his. "Thank you for keeping me, for giving me a chance, for building this life with me. Do you think we will have another 10 years? I think we will have as many as we are given. And I plan to make the most of every single one." They did make the most of them. The years rolled on, bringing changes and challenges and joys. The turn of the century came, and with it, new technologies and new ways of doing business. They adapted, adding motorized vehicles to their fleet in the early 1900s, though they kept the horses too because some routes were still better traveled the old way. The world changed around them, but some things stayed the same. The mountains still stood to the north. The creek still ran behind their house. And every evening when they could, they sat on their porch and watched the sun go down together. In 1911, Quinn turned 51. His hair was mostly gray now, and his knees ached in the mornings, especially when the weather was changing. But he could still work a full day, and he did, because the work mattered to him. One afternoon that fall, he and Kendra were going over the books in the office they had built next to their house. It was a comfortable space, lined with ledgers and maps and photographs of their wagons and coaches and, in later years, their trucks. "We should think about what happens next," Kendra said, not looking up from the ledger she was working on. "What do you mean?" "I mean we are both past 50 now. We have built this business into something substantial, but we do not have children to pass it on to. We need to think about succession." Quinn leaned back in his chair. They had talked about this before, in vague terms, but never seriously. "What do you want to do?" I think we should start training Robert and Sarah to take over." Robert's daughter Sarah had joined the business 5 years earlier and had proven to be as sharp and dedicated as her father. Give them more responsibility, more decision-making power. Then in a few years we sell them the business at a fair price. They can pay us over time and we can keep a small stake if we want to stay involved. "And what would we do?" She looked up at him then. "Whatever we want. Travel maybe, or just sit on our porch and enjoy the view. We have worked hard for 25 years, Quinn. Maybe it is time to let someone else do the heavy lifting." He thought about it. Part of him resisted the idea of stepping back. The business was his life, their life, the thing they had built together from nothing. But another part of him, a part that was growing larger as the years passed, wanted exactly what Kendra described. Time to rest. Time to enjoy what they had built instead of always building more. "All right," he said. "Let's do it." They spent the next 3 years gradually transferring control of James and Yates Transport to Robert and Sarah. It was not always easy. There were disagreements about strategy and growing pains as the younger generation put their own stamp on things. But by 1914, the transition was complete. Robert and Sarah owned the business, and Quinn and Kendra had enough money to live comfortably for the rest of their lives. They kept their house, of course, and the land it sat on. They kept their involvement in the community, because Manassa was their home and they cared about it. But they stopped working 12-hour days. They stopped worrying about freight schedules and employee problems and whether the trucks needed repairs. Instead, they did what they had always talked about doing. They traveled, taking trips to California and Oregon and even back to Texas, where Quinn showed Kendra the ranch he had grown up on. They read books and took up hobbies. Quinn learned to paint, badly but enthusiastically. Kendra finally had time to work on the garden she had always wanted, and their yard became a riot of color every spring and summer. They grew old together, slowly and gratefully. In the spring of 1920, they took a trip to Antonito. They had been there many times over the years, but this time felt different. They were both 60 now, past the age where the future stretched out endlessly. They were aware, in the way older people are, that their time was finite. They stood on the platform where Quinn had jumped off the train 34 years earlier. The depot looked different now, modernized and expanded, but the tracks were the same, and the mountains in the distance were the same. "I keep thinking about that day," Quinn said. "About how scared I was walking back. I did not know if you would want me to stay. I did not know if I was making a huge mistake. But you did it anyway. But I did it anyway." Kendra took his hand. Her fingers were knotted with arthritis now, but her grip was still strong. "Do you know what I think about?" "What?" "I think about how I almost did not wave, how I almost just turned around and walked home after the train left. But something made me stay. Something made me keep waving even though it seemed pointless. And because I did, you saw me, and you came back. We were lucky. We were. But we also worked for it. Coming back was the romantic part, Quinn. But staying was the hard part. Building a life together, dealing with all the boring and difficult and unglamorous parts of being with another person. That is what really mattered." He knew she was right. The walk back from Antonito made a good story, the kind of story people loved to hear at parties. But the real story was everything that had come after. The fights and the compromises and the years of waking up next to each other and choosing every single day to keep building their life together. "I would do it all again," he said. "Even the 12 miles on bleeding feet, even that." They took the train back to Manassa that evening. As the locomotive pulled away from Antonito, Quinn looked out the window at the platform disappearing behind them. He thought about himself at 26, standing up in a moving train because he could not stand to leave. He had been so young then, so full of certainty that he barely understood. But he had been right. The young Quinn had not known what he was choosing, not really, but he had chosen right anyway. Kendra leaned against him as the train rocked gently along the tracks. "What are you thinking about?" "About that kid who got off the train all those years ago. About how he had no idea what he was doing. But he did it anyway. But he did it anyway." They lived another 15 years after that trip to Antonito. 15 years of quiet mornings and companionable evenings, of small joys and smaller sorrows. Kendra's arthritis got worse, and Quinn's heart started to give him trouble. But they took care of each other, the way they always had. James and Yates Transport continued to operate under Robert and Sarah's leadership, growing into one of the largest freight companies in southern Colorado. People still talked about the couple who had founded it, the cowboy who had walked back from Antonito, and the woman who had kept waving, on a warm June evening in 1935, 49 years after Quinn had walked back to Manassa. They sat on their porch as the sun went down. They were both 75 now, fragile in the way very old people are, but their minds were still sharp and their love for each other was still strong. "You remember what you said to me that first night when I bandaged your feet?" Kendra asked. Quinn thought back, reaching through almost 5 decades of memories. "I said a lot of things that night. You said you wanted to be someone who stays, who builds something that matters. I remember. Did you? Do you think you did that?" He looked at her, this woman he had loved for half a century, who had given him everything he never knew he wanted. He looked at the house they had built together, the land they had made into a home. He thought about the business they had created, which still bore both their names and still served the community they loved. "Yes," he said, "I think I did. Me too." They sat in silence as the stars began to appear overhead. The mountains were dark shapes against the deepening blue of the sky. The creek murmured its eternal song. Everything was exactly as it should be. "I am glad you came back," Kendra said, not for the first time. "I am glad you kept waving," Quinn answered, not for the first time. And sitting there on their porch, holding hands as they had for 49 years, they watched the last light fade from the western sky and knew that they had lived exactly the life they were meant to live. Together.